Casey's Coast to Coast.
Now we're up to another first American hit, a song called New Song. It's by another Englishman who says he got his recording contract because of a devious promotion he concocted. He's Englishman Howard Jones, now in his mid-20s. He had been a musician all through his teens, then dropped out of music. But about 3 years ago, Howard became interested in synthesizers. So interested that he jumped headfirst back into music. Soon he was playing his synthesizers in one-man shows at small clubs and pubs around his home in the English town of High Wycombe. Well, one of the regular customers at one of the pubs was a young woman named Jan Smith. She took a fancy to Howard, and he took a fancy to her. Jan became Howard's manager, and then his wife. Together they came up with a wild promotion idea. They started publishing a phony fan magazine devoted exclusively to Howard, a magazine that gave its readers the impression that Howard Jones was a popular artist with thousands of fans. Wife Jan was the editor and publisher and distributed the magazine free at Howard's shows. And Howard says it worked. He began to gain a real following, real fans. That attracted the attention of record labels, and eventually, Howard was signed to a recording contract. And he says it was all because of a phony fan club and a phony fan magazine. A magazine called Risk. Howard Jones is at number 29 this week with his first American hit. Here's New Song.
Casey's Top 40.
CT40 originates in Hollywood. Well, now we're up to the latest hit by an Englishman who has a very unusual two-man stage show, featuring a performer who doesn't make a sound. Unlike a lot of musicians, Howard Jones doesn't have a band. The only person making music during a Howard Jones show is Howard Jones. He plays all the instruments, does all the singing, does all the talking. But that doesn't mean he's alone on stage. You see, for the past few years, he's been accompanied by a fella named Jed Hoyle, a performer who doesn't make a sound. That's because Jed is a mime. While Howard performs, Jed does pantomime. He eats a sandwich, takes a nap, rides a bicycle, among other things. Howard Jones says, quote, Jed used to come to my shows and do his routines outside the clubs. Everyone liked him. So I thought it'd be great to have him on stage. And you know he has more freedom in the show than I do. He can do whatever he wants. I've got to stick to the music. Well, we asked Jed the Mime to introduce Howard this week in the Countdown. Go ahead, Jed. Take it away. Thank you, Jed. And in case you missed that, here's Howard Jones climbing 4 notches to number 22 with his latest, Everlasting Love.
Count them down on CT40.
I'm Casey Kasem. When Englishman Howard Jones did a concert in Moscow last summer, he didn't know what to expect from the crowd. What he found, says Howard, is that a Russian audience is very similar to an American audience, very enthusiastic and warm. These days, Howard's getting an enthusiastic reaction to his latest hit, climbing 3 notches to number 11. Here's Everlasting Love.
Number 28.
Now here's a singer who once worked in a factory making plastic wrap. Following that, he worked in a vegetable truck making the rounds among the customers in his native England. These days, he just works behind the synthesizer making rock and roll. Dropping 3 notches to number 28, here's Howard Jones with A Prisoner.
Casey's Top 40.
I'm Casey Kasem on Casey's Top 40. Well, now we're up to singer, songwriter, and meatless gourmet Howard Jones. His music conveys a spirit of optimism and fun, but when it comes to veggies, Howard is downright serious. You see, not only is Howard a vegetarian, so is his family and most of the people he travels with. And he always makes sure they're well fed. On one American tour, Howard brought along not 1, but 2 vegetarian cooks. He even had a special cooking setup flown over from England. But let's face it, not even a star like Howard Jones can pack along his own cook and kitchen all the time. And finding tasty vegetarian fare far from home was a persistent problem. So in 1987, Howard opened up his own vegetarian restaurant in the Big Apple, New York City. Howard called his eatery the Nowhere Cafe, and he filled the menu with delicious, wholesome recipes that he'd gathered from around the world. Well, the Nowhere Cafe was an instant hit. It became an in spot in New York. Record companies and movie studios held their big promotional parties there. And the Nowhere Cafe inspired more new vegetarian restaurants in New York. Howard felt that since he'd gotten the ball rolling, he could step back. So he began concentrating on his music again and recorded his first album in 3 years. From that CD, In the Running, here's Howard Jones climbing 2 notches to number 13 on Casey's Top 40 with Lift Me Up.
America's Top Hits.
10 years ago this week, one of the top hits in the USA was by Howard Jones, a man who's been both a successful musician and a successful restaurant owner. He says all things considered, he'd rather make music than dinner. Howard Jones has spent more than 20 years making music. He only spent 1 year running a vegetarian restaurant in New York City. But he says that 1 year was more exhausting than those 20 years put together. He says every day was filled with problems. Problems with cooks, problems with servers, problems with deliveries, problems with customers. The problems never ended. He says that by contrast, music is totally relaxed, both in the studio and on the road. And so even though his vegetarian restaurant was successful, he was happy to give it up and get back to doing what he likes to do most. 10 years ago this week, former restaurateur Howard Jones had one of the top hits in the USA. Here's Everlasting Love.
America's Top Hits.
15 years ago this week, one of the top hits in the USA was No One Is to Blame, by a British musician, a musician who often goes on tour with his parents. They sell his souvenirs. Over the years, Howard Jones' concert tours have been a homegrown affair. At first, his parents ran his fan club and responded to letters to Howard. Then, as Howard's success grew, he asked them to run the souvenir booth at his performances. They say there wasn't a bother. They were proud to be there to help their son. And Howard says it's perfectly consistent with his alternative image to have his folks along. He says, quote, "I love the fact that touring with your parents is so un-rock and roll." 15 years ago this week, Howard Jones had one of the top hits in the USA. Here's No One Is to Blame.
Counting down the hits with Casey Kasem.